No one was prepared for the phone call that came early that morning. In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Brentwood, a neighborhood known for privacy, prestige, and long Hollywood legacies, something felt terribly wrong. For days, a well-known home had gone silent. No returned calls, no movement, no sign of life. What began as a routine welfare check would soon turn into one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking stories Hollywood had seen in decades. When emergency responders from the Los Angeles Fire Department arrived at the residence on December 14, 2025, they had no idea whose lives they were about to uncover. Inside the home, they found two bodies, a 78-year-old man, a 68-year-old woman. Authorities initially withheld the names following standard protocol, but the silence outside was nothing compared to the shock that followed. Within hours, it was confirmed that the deceased were Rob Reiner, the legendary filmmaker whose career shaped generations of cinema, and his wife, Michelle Singer. The news sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. A man known for laughter, love stories, and timeless films had met a brutal and unimaginable end. As investigators began examining the scene more closely, the situation took a far darker turn. Officials reportedly discovered that both victims had suffered fatal stab wounds. This was not a natural passing. This was not an accident. It was violence. The home was immediately secured as a potential crime scene. Detectives began piecing together timelines, searching for signs of forced entry, and questioning how something so horrific could happen behind the gates of one of Los Angeles' most exclusive neighborhoods. No suspects were named, no clear motive emerged, only questions. Who would want a Rob Reiner dead? Why was Michelle Singer killed alongside him? And how could such a respected, beloved figure meet such a tragic end? As tributes poured in from actors, directors, and public figures, a chilling realization set in. This was not just the loss of a Hollywood icon. It was the beginning of a mystery that threatened to rewrite everything people thought they knew about Rob Reiner's final days. But to understand how this story ends, we must first go back to where it all began. Before the fame, before the films, before the legacy, before Rob Reiner became Rob Reiner. Long before tragedy would surround his name, Rob Reiner was born into a world already shaped by creativity, humor, and sharp observation. Rob Reiner entered the world on March 6, 1947, in New York City. For him, show business was not a distant dream. It was the air he breathed from his very first days. His father was Carl Reiner, a towering figure in American comedy, an actor, writer, director, and one of the most respected comedic minds of his generation. His mother, Estelle Reiner, was also an actress, remembered by many for her unforgettable line in When Harry Met Sally. Their home was not an ordinary household. It was a living classroom of storytelling, wit, and timing. Conversations were layered with humor. Observations were sharp. Creativity was not encouraged. It was expected. Growing up in that environment, Rob absorbed the rhythms of comedy and the storytelling, not as theory, but as instinct. He watched how jokes were built, how stories landed, how laughter could disarm tension and reveal truth. These lessons were not taught formally. They were lived daily. Yet, being the son of Carl Reiner came with a quiet pressure. Expectations followed him into every room. Success would never be enough unless it stood on its own. Rob Reiner would have to prove that his talent was not inherited, but earned. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, that opportunity arrived. Reiner stepped into the national spotlight through television, landing the role that would define his early career, Michael "Meathead" Stivic, on the groundbreaking sitcom All in the Family. Airing from 1971 to 1979, the show was unlike anything American television had seen before. It did not avoid controversy, it confronted it head-on. Reiner's character, a passionate and outspoken liberal, clashed constantly with Archie Bunker's conservative worldview. Their arguments reflected the real cultural battles dividing America at the time. Through sharp dialogue, humor, and emotional tension, Reiner helped turn All in the Family into a mirror of an entire generation's struggle. His performance was more than comedic. It was fearless. The role earned him multiple Emmy Awards and transformed him into a household name. For millions of viewers, Rob Reiner became a symbol of a changing America, younger, louder, unafraid to challenge authority. But even at the height of his acting fame, something else was pulling at him. Rob Reiner was already looking beyond the camera, and that decision would change not only his career, but the history of modern cinema. At the height of his success on television, Rob Reiner could have stayed exactly where he was. He was famous. He was respected. He was winning awards. For many actors, that would have been enough. But for Reiner, acting was only part of the story. What truly fascinated him was control over the entire narrative, the rhythm, the tone, the emotional truth beneath the dialogue. By the early 1980s, Rob Reiner made a decision that surprised many in Hollywood. He stepped away from the safety of acting stardom and moved behind the camera. It was a risk. Directing meant starting over. It meant proving himself all over again, this time without the protection of an iconic television role. Failure would not be blamed on inexperience. It would be personal. His directorial debut came in 1984 with This Is a Spinal Tap, co-written with Christopher Guest, Michael McKean, and Harry Shearer. The film was unlike anything audiences had seen before. Shot as a mockumentary following a fictional British rock band, it blurred the line between reality and satire with astonishing precision. The film did not simply make fun of rock culture, it understood it. It exposed the absurdity, the ego, and the fragile humanity behind the noise. Over time, This Is a Spinal Tap transcended cult status and became a cultural landmark, influencing generations of comedians, filmmakers, and even musicians. Phrases from the film entered everyday language. Scenes were endlessly quoted, and Hollywood took notice. What shocked many was not just that Reiner could direct, but that he possessed an almost uncanny instinct for storytelling. He understood pacing, he understood character, and more importantly, he understood emotion. What followed was one of the most remarkable directing streaks in modern film history. In 1985, Reiner delivered The Sure Thing, a romantic comedy that balanced humor with sincerity. A year later came A Stand By Me, adapted from a Stephen King novella. The film revealed a side of Reiner that few expected: tender, reflective, deeply human. Stand By Me captured the fragile transition between childhood and adulthood with quiet heartbreak and honesty. It resonated across the generations, cementing Reiner's reputation as a director of rare sensitivity. Then came The Princess Bride in 1987, a film that defied genre. Fantasy, romance, adventure, and comedy blended into something timeless. Though modest at the box office upon release, it slowly grew into one of the most beloved films of all time, quoted endlessly, cherished deeply, passed down across generations. By the late 1980s, Rob Reiner was no longer just a former sitcom star. He was one of the most trusted storytellers in Hollywood. But even as his professional life soared, his personal life was quietly moving toward a crossroads that would shape him just as deeply. Behind the applause and critical acclaim, Rob Reiner's personal life was navigating a far more complicated journey. In 1971, at the height of his rising television fame, Reiner married Penny Marshall. At the time, both were young, ambitious, and deeply immersed in the world of comedy and entertainment. Their relationship was built on shared humor, creative understanding, and a mutual respect for the demands of the industry. To many in Hollywood, their marriage felt like a perfect creative partnership. During their years together, Reiner took on one of the most meaningful roles of his life. He legally adopted Penny Marshall's daughter, Tracy Reiner, from her previous marriage. It was a decision that spoke volumes about his character. Fatherhood, to Reiner, was not defined by biology, but by commitment, love, and responsibility. Tracy would later follow the family path into acting, appearing in films such as A League of Their Own, directed by her mother. Even after the marriage ended, Reiner remained a steady and supportive presence in her life, reinforcing his belief that family bonds endure beyond legal titles. But as Reiner's career accelerated, the pressures of success quietly began to erode the foundation of his marriage. Long hours, constant travel, creative demands that left little room for stillness. By 1981, after a decade together, Rob Reiner and Penny Marshall divorced. It was a painful turning point for both of them. Yet, unlike many Hollywood breakups, theirs did not dissolve into bitterness. They maintained mutual respect and continued to speak warmly of each other in later years. The separation marked a shift. Penny Marshall would go on to become one of the most successful female directors in Hollywood history, and Rob Reiner, newly single, found himself standing at a crossroads, professionally powerful, personally uncertain. It was during this period of emotional transition that Reiner began pouring more of himself into his work, and soon one film in particular would change both his career and his heart in ways no one expected. A film about friendship, about timing, about love arriving when it is least planned. And through that film, Rob Reiner would meet the woman who would reshape his understanding of relationships forever. By the late 1980s, Rob Reiner was at the peak of his creative powers. Film after film had confirmed his reputation as one of Hollywood's most versatile directors. Yet emotionally, he was still carrying the quiet weight of a failed marriage and unanswered questions about love, commitment, and timing. Those questions found their way into his next project. In 1989, Reiner directed When Harry Met Sally, a romantic comedy that would ultimately redefine the genre. On the surface, it was a story about two friends navigating love, friendship, and emotional vulnerability over time. But beneath the humor and iconic dialogue was something far more personal. The film reflected Reiner's own doubts. At that point in his life, Reiner openly questioned whether lasting love was truly possible. That uncertainty originally shaped the story's ending, rather than offering audiences a neat, comforting resolution. Reiner considered leaving the characters emotionally unresolved, mirroring his own guarded outlook. But everything changed during the making of the film. While working on When Harry Met Sally, Reiner was introduced to Michelle Singer, a photographer whose perspective on relationships was grounded, thoughtful, and deeply honest. Their conversations went far beyond casual interaction. They spoke about love not as fantasy, but as work, about commitment not as obligation, but as choice. Those discussions quietly transformed Reiner's thinking. As filming progressed, his emotional outlook softened. The guarded cynicism that once defined his view on relationships gave way to cautious hope, and that shift directly altered the film itself. Reiner ultimately chose to rewrite the ending, giving the story a warm, affirming conclusion that suggested love could endure after all. The decision became one of the most celebrated endings in romantic comedy history. But the impact went beyond cinema. What began as creative influence soon became something deeper. Reiner and Singer's connection grew steadily, rooted not in fame or spectacle, but in understanding and emotional honesty. In 1989, the same year the film was released, Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer married. This marriage was different. Unlike his first, which unfolded during the chaos of early fame, this relationship emerged during maturity. It was quieter, more stable, and far more enduring. Together, they built a life centered on family rather than headlines. Over the years, they raised 3 children: Jake, born in 1991, Nick in 1993, and Romy in 1997. Fatherhood became a grounding force for Reiner, shaping his worldview and deepening the empathy that audiences felt in his later films. For decades, their marriage stood as a rare example of stability in an industry known for excess and volatility, which is why what would happen years later would shock so many, because no one expected a love story this steady to end in tragedy. As the years passed, Rob Reiner slowly stepped away from the constant noise of Hollywood. He continued to work, continued to direct, and continued to speak publicly about issues he believed in. But his personal life became increasingly private. The chaos of fame that once defined his early career was replaced by something far more valuable to him: stability. His marriage to Michelle Singer was widely regarded as the most fulfilling chapter of his life. Friends described their relationship as calm, grounded, and deeply supportive. Unlike many celebrity couples, they did not chase attention. Michelle, in particular, remained largely outside the public spotlight, choosing to focus on family and her work as a photographer and advocate. Their home in Brentwood reflected that choice. It was not known for parties or spectacle. It was known for quiet routines, familiar faces, and a sense of normalcy that Rob Reiner had worked decades to build. Fatherhood remained central to his identity. He often spoke about how raising children reshaped his understanding of responsibility, empathy, and storytelling. Even when some of his later films received mixed critical responses, Reiner never abandoned his core values as a filmmaker. He remained committed to character-driven stories and emotional clarity. To those who knew him personally, he was no longer just a legendary director. He was a husband, a father, a man at peace with his journey. As recently as June 2021, Reiner was still creatively engaged, speaking publicly about a television project he was developing with writer Ward Perry. The series was planned to span 10 to 13 episodes and explore the lives of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, tracing their childhoods until the moment their paths intersected. The project reflected Reiner's lifelong interest in power, morality, and the human cost of ambition. Nothing in his public life suggested danger, nothing hinted at fear. Nothing indicated that the quiet world he had built was about to collapse, which is why the silence that surrounded his home in December 2025 felt so unsettling. Calls went unanswered, Days passed without movement. Concern grew among those close to him. And then, on the morning of December 14th, everything changed. The life Rob Reiner had carefully constructed away from the spotlight would become the center of a tragedy no one saw coming. The call came quietly, but its consequences were deafening. On the morning of December 14th, 2025, emergency responders from the Los Angeles Fire Department were dispatched to a welfare check in Brentwood. The request was simple. Something felt off. A home that was usually responsive had gone completely silent. When first responders arrived, there were no signs of forced entry from the outside, no broken windows, no alarms blaring, just stillness. Inside, they made a discovery that would haunt everyone involved. 2 bodies were found within the residence, a 78-year-old man, a 68-year-old woman. At first, officials followed a standard procedure, withholding identities as next of kin notifications were underway. But word spread quickly that this was no ordinary welfare check. As investigators began their preliminary assessment, the tone shifted. Both individuals had suffered fatal stab wounds. What initially appeared mysterious now appeared violent, deliberate. The home was immediately secured as a potential crime scene, and detectives launched a full forensic examination. Every room, every surface, every possible point of entry was scrutinized. Within hours, authorities officially confirmed the identities: Rob Reiner and his wife, Michelle, a singer. The announcement sent shockwaves through Los Angeles and across the entertainment industry. Tributes poured in almost instantly. Actors, directors, writers, and political figures expressed disbelief and sorrow. Many struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the brutal nature of his death. Rob Reiner was not known for living dangerously. He was not surrounded by scandal. His life, especially in recent years, had been defined by calm routine and privacy, which made the circumstances even more disturbing. Investigators faced immediate questions. Was this a targeted attack, a personal dispute, or the work of an unknown intruder who somehow gained access without leaving obvious signs behind? At that moment, there were no suspects, no arrests, only unanswered questions. The once peaceful Brentwood home, long seen as a place of safety and stability, had become the epicenter of a growing mystery. And as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the story was far from over. As investigators worked behind closed doors, the world outside demanded answers. News outlets dissected every known detail. The lack of forced entry raised troubling possibilities. If no clear break-in had occurred, then how had the attacker entered the home? Was someone trusted involved? Or had the residents been more vulnerable than anyone realized? Law enforcement remained cautious. Officials emphasized patience as forensic teams processed evidence, reconstructed timelines, and examined the couple's final days. Detectives explored multiple scenarios, from a targeted attack to a personal dispute, even the possibility of an intruder who left little trace behind. But for the public, uncertainty only deepened the shock. Hollywood struggled to comprehend how a man synonymous with warmth, humor, and human connection could meet such a violent end. Rob Reiner's career had spanned more than 5 decades, from his early fame as meathead on All in the Family to his unforgettable films like Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, and When Harry Met Sally. His work had shaped the emotional language of generations. Michelle Singer, though largely private, was remembered by friends as a stabilizing force in Reiner's later life. Those close to the family spoke of her quiet strength, her devotion to their children, and the calm she brought to their home. Her death, alongside Reiner's, underscored the profound human cost of the tragedy. As tributes continued to pour in, a painful contrast emerged. On screen, Reiner had spent a lifetime telling us stories about friendship, love, justice, and redemption. Off-screen, his final chapter was defined by violence and unanswered questions. The very home that symbolized decades of creative success and family stability now stood sealed, silent, and heavy with grief. The investigation remained ongoing. Authorities offered few public details, reinforcing the sense that this was a case that would take time to unravel. For fans, colleagues, and loved ones, the waiting became its own form of anguish. Yet even amid uncertainty, one truth was clear. Rob Reiner's legacy could not be erased by the way his life ended. His films, his voice, and the emotional honesty he brought to storytelling would endure long after the headlines faded. Still, the mystery lingered, and until the truth emerged, the final moments of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer would remain a haunting question mark at the end of a remarkable life story. As days turned into weeks, the investigation continued quietly, away from the glare of cameras. Authorities remained tight-lipped, carefully examining evidence and piecing together the final moments inside the Brentwood home. For the public, the waiting was painful. There was no single explanation that could make sense of it all, no simple narrative that could reconcile a life devoted to storytelling, empathy, and humor with an ending marked by violence and loss. And perhaps that discomfort was unavoidable. Rob Reiner spent more than 50 years shaping how audiences understood friendship, love, justice, and moral courage. His films reminded people that growing up is painful, that love requires vulnerability, and that standing up for what is right often comes at a cost. He believed deeply in human connection, both on screen and off. Michelle Singer shared that belief quietly, away from fame. To those who knew her, she was the emotional anchor of Reiner's later life, a partner who brought balance, perspective, and calm. Together, they built a family defined not by celebrity, but by presence and care. Their deaths forced an uncomfortable truth into the spotlight. No amount of success, talent, or public admiration can fully shield a life from tragedy. Even the most respected figures carry hidden vulnerabilities behind closed doors. The walls of fame are thinner than they appear, yet while the circumstances of their passing remain shrouded in questions, what Rob Reiner left behind is unmistakable. His work continues to live on. In the laughter sparked by This Is a Spinal Tap, in the childhood memories stirred by Stand By Me, in the timeless romance of The Princess Bride and When Harry Met Sally. These stories endure, passed from generation to generation, long after the final credits roll. The Brentwood house may stand silent now, but the voice Rob Reiner gave to American cinema does not fade with it. His life reminds us that legacies are not defined by how they end, but by what they give to the world along the way. And in that sense, Rob Reiner's story is far from over.